So today is Friday, March 17th, and we're going to get started with some more Latin studies in this lesson. What I just explained was that in this lesson today, I'd like to go back and review the Latin noun declensions. And I'd like to do that because the next topic we're going to talk about is the declension of pronouns, and you won't be able to understand any talk about the declension of pronouns if we don't have the declension of nouns really clear in our mind. So today what I'd like to do is take some time just to review what we've covered so far in the accidents of the parts of speech, sort of bring that all back to mind, keep it fresh, and then move on into a more detailed review of the Latin noun declensions. And then next week, I plan to talk about the declensions of pronouns. And what's really cool about that is that once we get through these lessons on declensions, if you go back to your Latin reading lessons, things are going to start to make a lot more sense. So that's what's good about learning grammar when you're studying Latin reading. And hopefully most of you are giving attention just about every day to Latin reading, because that's one of the most important studies in the curriculum. So let me share my screen here. And we'll take a look at this lesson. Let me zoom in a little bit for you. So we're studying lesson 3 in Latin grammar. Up at the top of the page here, you can see lesson 3, the accidents. And we learn that the accidents of the parts of speech are things that happen to the parts of speech, different characteristics of the parts of speech. We learned that there are 8 parts of speech in Latin, so even though there are thousands and thousands of words, we can divide all of those words up into just 8 different kinds of words. And then the accidents of parts of speech are the characteristics of those 8 different parts of speech. So in chapter 3 here, we're learning about the characteristics of the parts of speech, of the classes of words. And we've gone through a couple of them. First of all, in rule number 12, we learned that a list of 10 things that happen to the parts of speech, 10 different accidents of the parts of speech. We learned that in lesson 12, in rule number 12. We see the translation here. There are certain things which accompany or happen to the parts of speech: number, case, gender, declension, conjugation, mood, tense, person, figure, and species. These things are called the accidents or the attributes of the parts of speech. So 10 different things that happen to the parts of speech, 10 different attributes or characteristics. And you're going to need to know what these things are. You're going to need to understand what number is, what case is, what gender is, what declension is, and so forth. So that's what we're going to work on together. And the reason why I'm spending so much time on grammar in these Latin meetings, we could talk together in Latin, we could do Latin reading together, we could do Latin vocabulary together. But the reason why I'm going to spend most of the time talking about grammar is that grammar is the most important part of those studies, and it's the part that students usually don't like to study by themselves. So I'm sort of the motor that'll help drive us through these grammar studies. And the other studies, like Latin reading and vocabulary, usually students do well in those studies by themselves without much help. So I'm going to focus my attention on the study that nobody likes, which is grammar, which is actually the study that I think in the end you'll find most enjoyable, but it's just hard when you're a student to work through it on your own. So I'm going to focus on grammar here. But we'll take some time now and then to go over some Latin reading or vocabulary, or even practice some Latin speaking. We'll do that in time. But for now, I'd like to get us through the basics of grammar. Otherwise, we can't do those things anyway. So we learned about the 10 different accidents of the parts of speech. Then in Rule 13, we learned about the numbers of nouns: numeri nominum, pronominum, verborum, et participiorum. That's the number of nouns, pronouns, verbs, and participles. So we learned about number in rule number 13. We learned that there are 2 numbers. Who knows what the 2 numbers are? Chat them if you know them. What are the 2 numbers in Latin grammar? Two numbers in Latin grammar. What are they? Let's see. Very good. Singular and plural. Welcome back, Abigail. Singular and plural. Very good. Okay, so we learned about the numbers of nouns, pronouns, verbs, and participles. Then down in Rule 14, we learned about the cases of nouns, and we learned about the 6 cases, and we can see the names of them here: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative, and ablative. So we learned about 6 cases of nouns and participles. 6 cases. So quick quiz. Which case is used when we are speaking of the subject of a verb? Which case is used to identify a subject? Nominative. Very good. Which case is used to express the direct object of a verb? A direct object of a verb, like I threw the ball. If I wanted to say the ball in Latin, what case would I use? What case identifies the object, direct object of a verb? Very good. Accusative. Which of the 6 cases is used when I address someone directly, when I speak to someone or call someone? Which case is used? Vocative. Very good. All right. Next, which case is used to show possession? So if I wanted to say of God, how would I say of God? Which case would I use? Genitive case, genitive case, genitive case. Good. Okay, if I wanted to express an indirect object of a verb, indirect object, so I threw the ball to Michael. If I wanted to say to Michael and I wanted to use a noun, what case would I use to express indirect object? Dative. Very good. And if I wanted to use a preposition or a phrase that has to do with the origin or place from which a thing is, or the place at which a thing is, if I wanted to use a preposition, which case would I normally use with a preposition? Which case would I normally use with a preposition? Okay, good. Ablative. Now, when I ask a question and you see that all the kids in the class are answering the same way and you alone answer different from them, that's a sign you're probably wrong. So the answer to that one was ablative case. Okay, ablative case. Good. So those are the 6 cases. We talked about those cases, what they're used for. But the knowledge of the cases is useless if you don't know the forms, because the cases are identified in Latin by the different forms of the word. So you have to know the forms of the cases, or else you can't figure out what the cases are. So knowing the cases is important, but being able to identify the cases, that's the real challenge. So we went on from Rule 14 down to 15, and we talked about genders. We talked about 3 primary genders. What are the 3 primary genders? Who can tell me what the 3 primary genders are of Latin nouns? Good. You can use abbreviations. That's fine. Very good. Okay. Good. So the 3 primary genders are masculine, feminine, and neuter. You guys are doing pretty good so far. 3 primary genders are masculine, feminine, and neuter. What does the word neuter mean in Latin? What does the word neuter mean? And again, you might not know these things. If you don't know these answers and you're just getting started with grammar, don't think that you're, you've got something wrong with you. You might just not have studied this yet. What does neuter mean in Latin? No gender, neither, nothing. Okay, those are pretty good guesses. It means neither. The word neuter in Latin means neither. So we really have 2 genders, masculine and feminine. There's masculine and feminine. And then neuter is just the 3rd class, and it just means neither masculine or feminine. So there's really 2 genders, and then the 3rd gender is just none of the above. Okay, so that's masculine, feminine, and neuter. Then we learned about some other genders. we learned about common of two, where a certain word can be used to represent masculine things or feminine things. Who can give me an example of a common of two noun? Who can give me an example of a noun whose gender is common of two? No, not rock. I don't think rock is a good example. We don't have masculine and feminine rocks. No, cigarette is not a good example. I don't know where in the world you got that. Obviously, the Romans weren't talking about cigarettes, right? We invented that craziness. Think of an example of a common of two noun. All right, I see some good examples in there. Chicken is a good example. Parents is a good example. So we see a person. Okay, that's good. So we see that a common of two noun is a name of a thing, a name. Remember, a noun is just a name. Common of two is a name that is used to refer to a masculine thing or to a feminine thing, a male or a female. So chicken would be a good example. Dog, cat, all of these different names we have for animals where we refer to either masculine or feminine. Those are examples of common of two nouns. So those are good. Other words like man and woman, those would not be common of two because they refer to only one gender. With animals, we have like bull that refers to a male animal, and then we have cow that refers to a female. We have rooster that refers to a male, and hen that refers to a female. But then we have chicken, which refers to both male and female. So that's an example of a noun whose gender is common of two. Okay. So we've got masculine, feminine, neuter, common of two, and then we've got common of three. Excuse me. Common of three, we said common of three is a noun that can be used for masculine, feminine, or neuter. What kind of word? Now, this is going to be challenging. You've got to really remember what I said here. What kind of word is used with a common of three gender? What kind of word? What kind of word has common of three gender? Good, guys. I see some correct answers already. That's good. I see wise as one example. That's good. Living being, that's good. Huck wrote good. That's good. That's actually a good example of a common of three. Smart, good. So what you're listing here are adjective nouns. Okay, and that's good. Adjective nouns are usually common of three. We take a word like wise. That might not be a best example. Let's say we take a color like white. We can say he is a white man, she is a white woman, and that is a white stone, right? So we can use an adjective to name any different gender. So common of three, those are nouns that can be any of the three genders, and normally they're adjectives. So that was good. So some of you remembered and gave some examples of adjectives. So good. So we have common of three. Then we get into a few that are a little more confusing, a little more difficult. Once we get past common of two and common of three, those are pretty simple. Then we get into these last two. The second to last one is called promiscuous or Episine gender. And we're told to which under one gender and one article, both sexes are included. So this gets a little bit confusing. So we have an example. I think the example is the only way to really understand this as a student. We have the noun corvus, which is the Latin word for crow. A crow is called corvus. A sparrow is called passer. An eagle is called aquila. So we have these words and they have one gender. All right, this is what's confusing. The word itself has one gender. So corvus has the pronoun hic before it. What does that mean? What does it mean when we see the pronoun hic in front of a noun? What does that mean? Who knows? The word means this, that's right, but that's not why it's put in front of the noun here. Why is it put in front of the noun here in our grammar lesson? Very good. Some of you got it. It's because it's showing us that it's a masculine noun. It's being used as a sign of the gender. Okay, so hic, the pronoun hic is being used as a sign of the masculine gender. So the noun corvus, which means crow, is a masculine noun. The noun itself is masculine. It has a masculine pronoun. But that word is used to refer to both the male and the female crow. But the gender doesn't change. So if I was talking about a female crow, I would say hic corvus. And that's kind of weird because that's a masculine form being used to refer to a feminine bird. So Episine, the Episine gender is where the word itself has one gender, but it's used to name both genders of whatever the thing is, let's say an animal. Okay, so Episine it's like common of two, but it's not like common of two. So it's a little bit different. It has its own name. It's called the Episine or the Promiscuous Gender. Aquila is another example. If we look at Aquila, we see the pronoun haec in front of Aquila, H-A-E-C, haec. What does the pronoun haec mean in front of the noun Aquila? Very good, very good, very good. Well, yeah, you can say the, but what I'm talking about is gender here, okay? And you got it. It's feminine. Very good, okay? It shows us that this is a feminine noun, but the name Aquila is used to refer to the male eagle and the female eagle, but it's a feminine noun. When that happens, we call that Episine gender, okay? The noun has one gender, but it's used to refer to both genders of the actual thing it's naming. So that's the promiscuous or the Episine gender. And again, these get a little confusing, and they're not very common. So it's important to know about them, but you're not going to see them very often. And then lastly, we learned about one other gender. We learned about the doubtful gender, dubium, the doubtful gender. And the last one, this one, the doubtful gender, is we just don't know what the gender of the thing is. We don't know. And the reason why we don't know is because if we look back to ancient Roman writing, sometimes they used masculine, sometimes they used feminine, and it looks like you can make a choice and use whatever you want. So an example, they give us the word stone. If you find the word silex in Latin writing, you'll find that some authors use it as a masculine noun, some authors use it as a feminine noun. So we don't know. It's uncertain. It's doubtful what the gender is. So those are the 5 genders. But what I want you to remember is 3 of them are very simple, the 3 primary genders, and all the other genders are just based on those. So keep the 3 genders in mind, make sure you understand what they are, and then over time with experience, you'll get used to the other genders. Common of 2 is simple, common of 3 is simple, but then Episine and doubtful, they can be a little confusing, but you'll get used to them from experience over time. I'm not sure. In English, that's a good question from Joshua and Giovanni. I'm not sure which one of you is actually writing it. In English, is there a doubtful gender in English? The answer to this is usually no, because in English, we don't use gender in the same way that we use it in Latin. In English, it's very, very simple. Male things are masculine, female things are feminine, and everything else is neuter in English. So in Latin, let's say the word for tree might be a feminine noun. In English, it's just neuter because it's not a male or a female. So in English, we just call everything neuter that's not a living thing, that's not male or female, that's not an animal. We call everything else neuter. So English is just much simpler than Latin. Okay, so we learned about the genders, and then last week, to get to our current topic, last week we learned about declensions. How many declensions are there in Latin? How many declensions are there in Latin? Think, and then answer. Very good, 5. Okay, there are 5 declensions in Latin. Who can tell me in very brief terms, so just a short little phrase or something like that, who can tell me what a declension is? What is a declension? What are we talking about here? Take a minute, think about it, and just in a few words, try to summarize as simply as possible what a declension is. What is a declension? What is a declension? A group of different forms. That's very good. Forms of nouns. That's okay. Group of forms of nouns. All right. So let me just remind you here. A declension is a family of nouns that have the same endings. Okay. A declension is a family or a group of nouns that share the same ending. So they look alike. They have similar forms. There are 5 declensions or 5 different families. Like if I look at your pictures, and if I had all your brothers and sisters join you in the picture, we'd be able to look at the pictures and see that you look different. Each family has its own look. And we can point to the different pictures and say, there's one family, you can look at them. There's another family, look at them. There's another family, they all have similar features. And we'd be able to look at the different families and identify them based on their characteristics. And if we scrambled everybody up, we'd probably be able to figure out which family each of you belongs to by matching you up with brothers and sisters that look similar. So that idea of identifying things that belong to a group that have common characteristics, that's what the declensions are. Smell, well, I couldn't do that online, but yeah, I'm sure there's a number of different ways we can identify you. I can also identify you by your quiz scores, right? So be careful. Now, we have different families, right? Different families of nouns, and we can identify them by different characteristics. And this is what we talked about last week. Now, here's the question. How do we identify the different declensions? What's the key that we use to identify the different declensions? What did we talk about last week? Think and then write. Don't write and then think. What's the key to identifying the different declensions? Very good. Spelling, not so much, but the answers are pretty good. You guys spell like I do. All right, so good. So we look at the genitive singular, and you have to make sure you get both of these parts. We look at the genitive singular ending of nouns, and what we'll find, if we look at all the genitive singular endings of the nouns, we'll find that the different members of each declension or each family have the same genitive singular ending. So that's the key for us to identify which declension a noun belongs to. It doesn't matter what the other forms are. The other forms, can be found in a number of different declensions, so that doesn't help us. But the genitive singular ending is the key, okay, to identifying the declensions. Very good. So we talked about 5 declensions. So there are 5 different genitive singular endings. And this kind of stuff you guys have to memorize. Here in the lesson, we learn about the 5 declensions, and we learn that each of them has a different genitive singular ending, and you've got to memorize these 5 endings. You've got to memorize them and know to look out for them. So the first declension, in the first declension, what is the genitive singular ending that identifies the first declension? What's the genitive singular ending? The correct answer would be AE, okay? The diphthong AE, the 2 vowels joined together, AE. That's the first declension genitive singular ending. All right. What is the ending of the second declension that identifies the second declension? What's the ending of the second declension? Okay, looks good. So the English letter I, in English, that's called the letter E, but I don't want to be confusing. The English letter I is the mark of the second declension. Good. How about the third declension? What's the genitive singular ending that marks the third declension? Be careful. You can't mistype these because that makes it the wrong answer. The answer is is. Very good. Is. Good. So that's the third declension. How about the fourth declension? What's the genitive singular ending that marks the fourth declension? Very good. Us. Okay, that's very good. And then lastly, the fifth declension. What's the ending that marks the fifth declension? Be careful with spelling. If you spell it wrong, it's wrong. It's like a phone number. You can't spell a phone number wrong and still call somebody. Sometimes spelling's not that big of a deal. Sometimes spelling can get you in a lot of trouble. It's EI. That's the right answer. Good. So we have EI. Now, what's important to note about EI that this rule tells us, it says EI separated, separatis. AE in the first declension is a diphthong. So we have two vowels in one syllable. Two vowels are joined together in one syllable. We say I. That's how we pronounce AE. Or in church Latin, we say A. We pronounce two vowels in one syllable. In the fifth declension, this is just a note I want to make this week. I don't think I made it last week. In the fifth declension, those last two vowels, the E and the I, they're not a diphthong. So they're actually pronounced with two syllables. So we don't say, if you look at this word right here, if you can see this on your screen, we don't say D-A. It's not two-syllable word. It's not D-A, it's D-A-E. D-A-E. It's a three-syllable word. So that's what that rule is talking about when it says E and I separated. Okay? It's two syllables. So that's it. We've got the 5 Latin declensions, and we've got the 5 genitive singular forms that are used to identify those declensions. Now, how in the world can you figure out if you see a word in a reading and you've got a Latin reading lesson and you see a Latin word, Latin noun, how in the world can you know what the genitive singular ending is? How can you know that? How would you possibly know that? Give me some answers. How can you possibly know what the genitive singular form of a noun is? How can you figure it out? If you see the word verbum in the reading, how can you know what the genitive singular is? Very good. You can use a dictionary, okay? You can't look at the case because you don't know what the form is. If I see the word verbum, it's the first time I've ever seen that word, I have no idea what I'm looking at. Okay? It could be fourth declension, it could be second declension, I don't know. It could be third declension, I don't know. Right? So when I'm learning Latin and I don't know the words yet, I don't know the genders of the words yet, I don't know the cases of the words yet, what I've got to do is learn to use a dictionary. And I've showed you a couple different kinds of dictionary. There's the normal old-fashioned dictionary, like this one here that I keep on my desk. There's this normal old dictionary. This one, you have to already know what the nominative form is. So when you look it up, you're looking for the nominative form. And once you find the nominative form, it'll also show you the genitive form, which is what you need to know the declension. Or you can also use an online dictionary like the one I showed you, Whitaker's Words, where you can just type in any form and it will tell you all the forms of the word, okay? So Abigail, if you don't have a dictionary, I said last week, this is the best Latin dictionary, but it's real expensive, so I don't recommend it for students. You don't need a dictionary like this one that I keep showing. What I'd recommend is you either, and you, of course, you should ask your parents' permission on this, but there are online Latin dictionaries, and there's one called Whitaker's Words, which I shared. Let me just get it again. Just give me a second. Whitaker's Words is a dictionary that's hosted by the University of Notre Dame. It's this ugly-looking, simple thing. It didn't used to look ugly. It used to be a little more normal, but they made it ugly for some reason. But this dictionary online, it's silly looking, but it's actually a very powerful, very useful dictionary, because you can type in any form. You can type in any Latin word and it will tell you everything you need to know about that word. It'll tell you that it's genitive. It'll tell you that it's plural. It'll give you most of the possible meanings of the word. It'll show you the forms of the noun. It'll show you that for the word hominum, the nominative form is homo, the genitive singular form is hominis. It'll tell you what case it is. It'll tell you what number it is. It'll tell you the gender. It tells you all these things, okay? So Whitaker's words, and again, it's unfortunate that they made it look dopey with this design that they used, but it makes it look like a silly thing, but it's actually a very powerful tool that you can use. So, you know, regular old-fashioned dictionary in print, you know, you don't have to get an expensive one like this. You can find cheap ones that are like paperbacks that are good enough. Or if you use a tool like Whitaker's Online, you could just go to Latin. Look at the address here, latin-words.com, and you can just bookmark that in your browser and just save it and check it out whenever you need something. So we can use dictionaries to figure out the forms of the nouns and what declension they belong to. Okay, so that's good. So that's enough for declensions. Now, what I wanted to do today, since we've got a few minutes left, we had a good review and you guys did well answering those questions. No, Whitaker's Words is free. It's just it's just latin-words.com. And like I said, I don't want you bouncing all around the internet without your parents' permission. So don't start zinging all over the place, telling them Mr. Michael told you to do this and that, because that's not true. I said, you know, 50 billion times, check with your parents first. But if you want to see that website, it's latin-words.com. Okay. This book is expensive. I don't recommend you get this book. It's probably like $60 or $70. But this book here, this dictionary, you can actually find a free copy of this online in PDF form. So it's you can have it on your computer. If another website, and I'll just share another website with you. And again, I don't want you guys going to these sites without your parents' permission. But archive.org is a website that just has bazillions of free books. And so you can just search Latin dictionary. You can search Latin dictionary and it just has a million different Latin dictionaries and they're all free, okay? But they're in PDF form. Some of them you can just download and use. Some of them you have to use online by signing in and all this stuff. Now, let me just show you. This dictionary right here, you see an elementary Latin dictionary by Charlton Lewis. That's this dictionary. That's the same dictionary. Okay, so like I said, this costs $60 to have a printed copy from Oxford Press, but this same dictionary is available for free on archive.org. If I open it up, just give me a second here. We'll open this up and we'll see that this is the same Latin dictionary that I've got on my desk. Okay, if you look at this here, you can see it's just a simple old Latin dictionary. It's the same exact dictionary that you see here that you can get for free. You can download it on your computer or just use it on the internet. So you don't have to buy a Latin dictionary, okay? Yeah, archive.org is a great site. They've got tons of free stuff. The reason why they've got so much free stuff is because for books, when you publish a book is protected by copyrights. So nobody else can copy it or print it or use it without your permission, without buying the book. That lasts for 70 years after the author dies. So 70 years after the author dies, that book becomes what's called public domain. It means it's just a public book. So once the books become public domain, they can scan them in and share them for free, and then anybody can use them however they want. So these websites, this is called Internet Archive. It's got just a bazillion free books, and usually they're older. They're like 100 years old because they enter into public domain, okay? All right, spare us your chicken stories, Xavier. We don't want to know about your chickens. All right. So let's get back to our lesson here. All right. So if you need a dictionary, there's a million ways you can find dictionaries online for free. You don't have to buy anything. If you do want a printed dictionary, you don't need an expensive one like this. There are cheap ones. A good example is actually on this page. You can see like this one here is called the Pocket Oxford Latin Dictionary, Cassell's Latin Dictionary. This one here, this white and blue one, I know I see this in bookstores all the time. So you can find these and they just will cost a couple bucks. So if you need a Latin dictionary, you can go to a bookstore or go to Amazon and find cheap copies. And they're good enough for you guys. You don't need any fancy dictionary at this point. All right. So that's that. So we talked about declensions. We talked about how we identify the different declensions. We talked about how you can use a dictionary to look up words when you're not sure what the genitive singular ending is. So let's go on and now look at these declensions. And I've got a chart here. All right, so let's look at this chart. Let's stay focused on this lesson, or I'm going to start knocking people out of the chat room. If you look at the screen here, you can see all 5 of the Latin declensions with examples of each of the declensions. So this looks like a big blob of information, but it's actually a very helpful guide that you can use to identify any noun. So in this first column here, you have the first declension. And if you look, and let me just say this, I did not make this chart. I just pulled it up about 30 seconds before this video started so we can look at it. You'll notice that the cases are not in the same order that I put them in. So don't let the cases confuse you. Here's the genitive singular. It's the 3rd row here. So if we look here at the 3rd row, we can see that puella, the genitive singular is puellae. Puellae is the genitive singular. And you can see all the different forms: puella, puellam, puellae, puellae, puella. Then in the plural, puellae, puellas, puellarum, puellis, puellis. So you can see all the endings of the first declension with puella as an example. The genitive singular is ae. That's first declension. Second declension, the example they use here is servus. Servus. And here you can see the genitive singular ending is servi. The ending is e. And you can see all the different forms: servus, servum, servi, servo, servi, servos, servorum, servis. Those are second declension masculine endings. Then in this 3rd column, we see another second declension noun, but it's a neuter noun. It's a neuter noun. It's templum. It's a neuter noun, and that means some of the forms are different from the masculine noun, but we see the genitive singular is the letter I. That's what identifies the declension. So templi is of a temple. We've got templum, templi, templo, templa, templorum, templis. These are different forms of a second declension nouns. Then in this next section, we've got the 3rd declension. The 3rd declension, the genitive singular form is iis. The iis ending. One of you asked, where's the vocative? Many of these charts, they won't show the vocative because the vocative is almost always the same as the nominative. So they're just trying to save some space here, okay? All right, so 3rd declension, the genitive singular, the ending is is. All right, the ending is is. That's it with the chat. That's the last warning. Okay, pay attention, or I'm just going to start knocking you out of the meeting. Genitive singular ending is is. We see that there. We see the nominative form is rex. Then we see regem, regis, regi, rege, reges, regum, regibus, the different endings of the 3rd declension. We also have a neuter 3rd declension noun, nomen, which has some different forms, but the genitive singular is is. We then have the 4th declension, where the genitive singular is us, and the different forms. You can see that most of these forms have us in the ending. That's how we normally can easily identify a fourth declension noun. They've got a bunch of U's in the ending. And then lastly, we see the genitive singular EI in the fifth declension nouns. So this chart gives a quick overview of all of the 5 declensions. And in Latin grammar, I wouldn't want you to memorize this chart because the cases are in the wrong order. But in our course, you're going to memorize these endings. You're going to memorize an example noun for each declension, and then use that to figure out the forms of other nouns that belong to that declension. So I just wanted you to see all of the declensions laid out in a chart. This is where all the different forms come from. So when you're doing Latin reading and you see these nouns in all these different forms, this is where they come from. And I'll make a good chart for you and share it on the Latin grammar page. Maybe next week I'll share a link when we have our meeting. But to have a chart like this where you see all the forms laid out, when you see things in Latin reading, you can take a look at these charts, and usually you can figure out what the options could be. You might find that, for example, if I have a word with a UM ending, it could be second declension masculine, it could be neuter, it could be nominative neuter. It could be genitive plural of the third declension. It could be fourth declension. We see UM here and here. So there could be a bunch of options, but it gives me a limited number, okay? Maybe 4 or 5 options, and then I have to figure it out from there. So you should be able, just by your knowledge of all the endings, when you see a word, you should be able to narrow it down to just a couple possible options. And then usually, if you're translating, you can use the other words in the sentence to figure out which case it's actually in and make the right translation. So that comes with experience. But for now, you need to memorize these forms, and it's going to be difficult until you gain that experience, and then it becomes simpler. So anyway, we've got this overview of the 5 Latin noun declensions. And we reviewed the accidents that we've studied so far. So that's what I wanted to go over today. Like I said, I'm going to put together a good chart summary of the noun declensions for you. This one I don't recommend because, like I said, the cases are out of order. But I'll put together a chart for you and give it to you next week that allows you to have this. You can print it out or just keep it bookmarked on your computer, and you can always look at it for reference. So I'll get that ready for you. But we're through declensions now for nouns. And I think based on your answers to my questions, I think you've got a pretty good handle on declensions and the other characteristics as well. If you still feel shaky, go back and watch those old videos because we already went through everything. But next week, we're going to move on from nouns, and we're going to talk about the declension of pronouns. All right. So next week, we'll learn about all the different forms of pronouns. And as I said before, when you go back to your Latin reading, after you learn these things, you're going to start to see that it's not all craziness. There's actually very clear order in the Latin readings, and you just have to learn how to recognize things because it's like secret code. You've got translation is like, deciphering a secret code, figuring out what a secret code says. That's what makes Latin translation fun. So anyway, Latin declensions, we talked about that. We spent 2 weeks talking about declensions. I hope that's pretty clear. If it's not clear at this point, you need to just review these videos or just keep studying the Latin grammar lessons because we go through everything over time. That's all that I wanted to talk about today. So if you don't have any questions for me, you're free to take off. Have a good weekend. If you've got any questions, I'll hang around, answer any questions you've got until we close up. All right. So thanks for coming. Hope that's helpful. God bless everybody. Have a good weekend.